A trembling needle touched the cold, lifeless skin. A final breath, broken and ragged, like a confession whispered into the dead desert. And in that very moment, death had claimed the poor Mustang. But just as destiny struck its final blow, the laws of life and death were shattered. Across the Dustveil desert, where life crumbled into grains of dust, a dying creature survived against all odds. Not because of medicine, not because of miracles, only because of a primal call pulsing through its veins. I refuse to surrender. This story will not just overturn everything you thought you knew about life and death. It will tear apart the fragile line between logic and faith. Step into this journey, if you dare to face the ultimate limits within yourself. And when this story ends, you will find yourself wondering, perhaps the true miracle is not saving a life, but awakening the untamed spirit buried deep within us all. The story begins on a freezing morning in Dustveil, where the wind cut like broken glass, and the sun rose only to expose what the night tried to hide. The first light spilled across the Dustveil desert like the dying breath of a fallen soul, pale, cold, and heavy with despair. Endless stretches of silver-gray dunes sprawled into the horizon, with no birdsong, no signs of life. Only the wind, dry and sharp as a blade, whipped up clouds of dust over the cracked earth. Dr. Elena Rose squinted through the dusty windshield of her battered old truck. Her gloved hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the cold seep through the leather. 10 years as a wildlife veterinarian, she had witnessed her share of miracles and her share of death. But the early morning call from Glenn Maddox, the seasoned ranger of this forsaken land, chilled her more than any desert wind ever could. "There's a special horse, Elena," Glenn's gravelly voice had said over the phone. "And it's dying." Those words echoed in Elena's mind like a ghostly refrain the entire drive. Special? Dying? The tires slid slightly over loose sand as she turned onto the narrow path leading down into the dry basin. In the distance, a handful of BLM pickup trucks were clustered around a makeshift holding pen. A red flag flapped violently in the wind, the familiar sign of an animal emergency. Elena pulled over, grabbed her medical kit from the passenger seat, and stepped into the biting morning air. The wind struck her face with a salty sting of dust and bitterness. The rising sun made the dunes shimmer, not with warmth, but with a sheen of deadly frost. Glenn Maddox was waiting. A man in his 50s, sun-worn skin, and deep lines carved around his eyes. Lines not just from age, but from witnessing too much of life's cruelty. He approached, boots sinking into the sand. His gaze weighted with things words couldn't carry. "Thanks for coming so quickly," Glenn said, voice rougher than usual. "He's in there." Elena nodded, following him toward the pen. Each step felt heavier, sinking her deeper into an air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the heavy, unmistakable presence of suffering. And then she saw him. Silverthorn, a wild stallion of breathtaking beauty. His silver-dusted coat now matted with dirt and blood, his mane clumped into grimy tangles. He stood trembling, head bowed low, his right hind leg barely touching the ground. From the torn flesh of his leg, blood had dried into dark, crusted rivers, the gash so deep that tendons and muscle lay exposed. Infection had spread. The stench of rot clung to him like a second skin. And his eyes, deep amber dulled by agony, flickered with the last fragile sparks of resistance. Elena froze. In all her years, she had never seen a creature so magnificent and so heartbreakingly broken. Caught in old barbed wire fencing, Glenn said hoarsely. Probably trapped there for days. Elena closed her eyes briefly, her heart constricting. This wasn't just another rescue case. This was the last stand of a free spirit. She moved slowly toward Silverthorn. The stallion lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring at the scent of a stranger. Despite the pain racking his body, his muscles tensed, his entire frame poised to explode into flight if he could. The wild instinct refusing to yield even now. Pride. To the very last breath. Elena crouched low, resting her hand lightly on the cold wire, whispering, "I won't hurt you. I promise." But she knew. Sometimes, promises meant nothing in the face of unbearable pain. Glenn exhaled heavily beside her. "The chief vet's orders are to prepare for euthanasia," he said. "No one believes he can survive." And honestly, Glenn looked at Silverthorn, a look of a man who had seen too many lives fade under his watch. "It might be the kindest thing we can do for him." Elena tightened her grip on the strap of her medical kit. Her hands felt numb, and not because of the cold. One decision, one needle, one farewell to a creature she hadn't even had the chance to truly touch. Silverthorn stood there, unmoving, a silver ghost against the desolate morning light. Each shallow, ragged breath was a war waged against the inevitable. Elena knew. Within minutes, she would have to choose. Choose to be the merciful hand of release, or the one who would extinguish the final flame of a free soul. The desert wind howled through the rusted wire fence, weaving ghostly cries across the silent valley. Before Elena, Silverthorn stood, a silver ghost battered by the elements. His once proud ash-gray coat was now matted with filth and dried blood, clinging tightly to his wasted body. His legs, once pillars of strength that had carried him over mountains and valleys, now trembled. His right hind leg grotesquely swollen, raw flesh gaping open and oozing pus. The putrid stench of infection saturated the air. Silverthorn's amber eyes, once fierce, were now clouded with agony. His ears drooped, twitching faintly in the biting wind. Every breath he drew was shallow and labored, each one a battle against the inevitable. Elena tightened her grip on the medical kit, stepping forward, her heart constricting painfully. She wished she didn't recognize the signs so well. Silverthorn's pulse, if it could still be called that, was no more than a fading thread. He wasn't just injured. He was disintegrating. And though Elena's medical training cataloged every clinical detail, the human within her, the woman who believed in wild freedom, screamed in protest. "We need to decide soon," Glenn said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "He's suffering every second." Elena lowered her gaze, biting her lip so hard she tasted blood. She had witnessed countless deaths, some merciful, some brutal, but never like this. Because Silverthorn wasn't just another wild horse. He was a living testament to freedom itself. A creature carved from the dust, the wind, and the forgotten songs of Dustveil, now reduced to a crumbling wreck behind steel bars. I want to try, Elena said hoarsely. Her eyes locked onto Silverthorn. Glenn stared at her for a long moment, before shaking his head grimly. You know the odds, Elena. Less than 5%. She knew. Of course, she knew. She knew the data. The prognosis. The thin line between hope and cruelty. But as she looked into Silverthorn's fading yet unbroken gaze, she couldn't walk away. Not this time. I'll get ready, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Glenn said nothing more. He turned and made his way back to the truck, retrieving the euthanasia kit. A quiet death packed neatly in a sterile bag. Elena moved toward her own vehicle, hands trembling as she unlocked the medical bag. Inside lay the vial of pentobarbital, cold and merciless. A syringe. And 4 set soft gauze wraps meant to ease the final moment. Everything was prepared. All that remained was the decision. The 4 line was inserted into the fragile vein along Silverthorn's neck. A trickle of life-saving fluids began dripping into his bloodstream, slow as a whisper across the parched desert floor. Elena crouched beside him, holding the line with both hands, as if her touch could anchor him to this world. She silently counted each beat. 1, 2, 3. Waiting, hoping, dreading. A faint sound escaped Silverthorn's throat. He swayed, his front legs trembling. But he did not fall. The dawn light sliced through the gaps in the wire fence, casting sharp beams across his battered frame. His eyelids fluttered, tiny tremors rippling through his lashes. With every shuddering breath, he was still fighting. Each breath, a declaration against death. Not much time, Glenn said quietly, glancing at the handheld vitals monitor. If you're going to... Elena shook her head fiercely. Not while he's still standing, she said. Glenn exhaled heavily, turning his gaze away. The air thickened, heavy with dust, and the scent of blood and infection. Every second dragged like a stone across their nerves. Elena tightened her grip on the pentobarbital syringe hidden in her coat pocket. Waiting, hoping, but knowing. Silverthorn sagged forward. His legs buckled. Elena's breath caught. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was selfish to hope any longer. Her fingers brushed the syringe. One quick jab. One act of mercy. But then, a tremor rippled along Silverthorn's spine. Elena stiffened. Glenn turned sharply. Silverthorn inhaled. A ragged, raw, desperate gasp. The strongest breath he had taken in hours. Not a death rattle. A breath of defiance. A breath of life. Elena surged forward, checking the 4. The sunlight caught her face, glinting off beads of sweat that traced her temples. Silverthorn's eyes fluttered open, still clouded, still exhausted. But somewhere within, a flicker, a spark. He's responding, Elena whispered, barely believing her own voice. Glenn inched closer, his face awash with something like awe. Something was happening. Something not born of medicine or human will. The desert held its breath. The world narrowed to this single trembling heartbeat. Silverthorn staggered, And then, with a motion so small it almost seemed imagined, he shifted his weight and took one staggering step forward. Tiny, broken, unbelievable. A cry tore from Elena's chest, not of grief, but of wonder. She disconnected the four. Glenn didn't protest. There was no need. Silverthorn had made his choice, and they, mere humans, could only stand and bear witness. Elena bowed her head, pressing her palms together over her chest. This was no longer a rescue mission, no longer a question of treatment. It was something far older, a reckoning between the creature and the wild forces that had shaped him. A sharp gust howled across the basin, whipping dust into feral whirls. Silverthorn stood at the center of the rising storm, a lone battered figure, etched against the morning sky. His silver-gray coat, ragged, bloodied, caught the sunlight, shimmering with ghostly fire. For a moment, he seemed forged from the desert itself, a spirit of dust and stubborn, burning life. He lifted his head slowly, painfully, and from the depths of his battered frame came another breath, deep, sure, unbreakable. Elena knelt in the sand, tears filling her eyes, not out of sadness, but awe. Because here, in the cold, brutal heart of Dustveil, she had seen a miracle. Not one crafted by human hands, but by the indomitable will of life itself. The sandstorm swept in from the west, howling like an invisible army, scouring all traces of life from the earth. Elena shielded her eyes with her hand, peering through the swirling haze. A battered pickup truck, its paint faded by endless sun and wind, made its slow, deliberate descent into the valley, its tires slipping on the powdery sand. Glenn narrowed his eyes and gave a slight nod. "He's here," he murmured. Elena tightened her grip on the medical bag, feeling her heart hammer faster than the desert winds. She had never met Tomas Greyfeather, only heard half-whispered tales that bordered on legend. A man belonging to another world. A man who healed not with medicine, but with something deeper. Something more ancient than Dustveil itself. The truck stopped a few meters from the makeshift fence. The door creaked open. A tall man stepped out, moving slowly, each step carrying the weight of history. His long silver hair was tied neatly into a braid that hung down his back. His skin, darkened and cracked by the sun, was lined deeply, like the canyons etched into the heart of Dustveil. He wore a soft leather coat, embroidered with faded tribal markings that time itself had struggled to erase. A worn leather pouch hung from his belt. No greetings, no wasted movements, only a profound silence. A silence heavier and more commanding than any words. Tomas stopped in front of the fence, where Silverthorn still stood trembling amidst the storm. He didn't rush. He simply stood there, studying the silver stallion, like a man gazing at a warrior who had crossed an entire lifetime to arrive at this single moment. The wind tugged violently at Tomas's cloak, sending his white hair flying behind him, like a lone bird against the gray, broken sky. Glenn approached and offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming," Glenn said, his voice rough against the howling wind. Tomas returned a slight nod, never taking his eyes off Silverthorn. "I ask for permission," Tomas said, his voice low and steady, "to be with him before any final decision is made." Elena glanced at Glenn. No words were needed. She nodded. "Here, now." Every rule bent before. Whatever it was Tomas had brought with him. Tomas stepped across the fence. Slowly. Deliberately. As if crossing some sacred boundary. Silverthorn shuddered. His whole body quivered. Near collapse. But he did not bolt. Did not thrash. He stood there. His clouded amber eyes locking onto Tomas. The Washani elder knelt down. Right there on the cold, cracked earth. He placed the leather pouch carefully before him. The storm raged around them. But within that small circle, between Tomas and Silverthorn, there was an eerie, sacred stillness. Tomas reached into the pouch and withdrew bundles of dried herbs. Small, dark brown sprigs, heavy with the scent of old earth and long-forgotten rain. He crushed them in his withered palms, sprinkling them into a small circle around himself and Silverthorn. Then, with a deep, gravelly voice, he began to sing, not with words, but with sounds, low, broken tones, like wind moaning through ancient caves, like the heartbeat of the land, before it even had a name. Elena sank to her knees, breathless. She couldn't understand the sounds, but she could feel them, pulsing through her bones, stirring blood and memory, in places too deep for language. And Silverthorn, he lifted his head, just slightly, a movement so small, it would have been easy to miss. But to Elena, it was seismic. Glenn exhaled sharply, awe in his voice. He lifted his head. The sandstorm screamed louder, ripping at the earth with feral claws. Yet inside the fragile circle of crushed herbs and ancient song, something was awakening. Something older than the desert. Something even the dust itself seemed to pause in honor. The storm raged harder now, the sand slicing across the valley like 1,000 invisible knives. Yet inside the fragile circle Tomas had drawn, there was a stillness, a heartbeat suspended between two worlds. Tomas continued his chant, each note vibrating in the bones of the earth. Elena felt it deep within her. A trembling, a low resonance that stirred something primal in her blood. This was not just a song. It was a bridge between life and death, between surrender and defiance. Silverthorn shivered, his body quaking under the strain. For a moment, Elena feared he would collapse entirely. But then, he shifted his weight. His front hoof scraped the sand. Just a tiny motion, but it was deliberate, intentional, a choice. Tears stung Elena's eyes. This was no longer a creature awaiting mercy. This was a being who had decided, against every physical limit, against every crushing certainty, to stand. Tomas's voice grew stronger, rising against the wind. The dried herbs burned faintly now, releasing sharp, ancient scents into the swirling air. Sage, juniper, bitterroot. Each breath Silverthorn drew seemed fuller, deeper. No longer the rasping gasp of the dying. It was uneven, ragged, but it was alive. Glenn watched, jaw slack, hands clenched at his sides. He had seen miracles once or twice, in the brutal stretches of Dustveil, but nothing like this. Nothing so visceral. Nothing so undeniable. Tomas reached into his pouch once more, drawing out a small bundle, wrapped in deerskin. Inside it, powders ground from desert plants, known only to those who still listen to the land. He smeared the mixture along his fingertips, and, with slow reverence, touched it to Silverthorn's wounded leg. Elena held her breath. Silverthorn flinched at the touch, a ripple of pain coursing through his frame. But he did not lash out. He did not bolt. He accepted it. Tomas leaned close, whispering something inaudible. Against the roar of the storm, his words were not meant for human ears. They were for Silverthorn alone, for the battered spirit. Hovering at the edge of existence, the stallion's ears twitched forward. His nostrils flared, catching the scents of crushed herbs, human sweat, and ancient dust. A tremor passed through him, stronger this time. Not a convulsion of weakness, but a surge, a gathering. And then, in one staggering, breath-stealing moment, Silverthorn took a step forward. A real step. Elena gasped aloud. Glenn swore under his breath, unable to tear his eyes away. Silverthorn staggered once, almost falling, but he caught himself, head low, legs trembling, and still standing. The sandstorm howled around them, a living wall of fury and chaos. Yet in the eye of it, a single creature defied death itself. Silverthorn stood amid the storm, battered and bleeding, and refused to fall. Tomas ceased his chanting. He sat back on his heels, breathing deeply, his face shining with sweat and dust. He did not smile. He did not weep. He simply watched, the way one watches a mountain refusing to bow to the winds of time. Elena pressed a hand to her heart. In all her years among the wild and broken creatures of the desert, she had never witnessed anything like this. Science would have no explanation. Statistics would laugh it off as impossible. But here it was. Real. Raw. Undeniable. In the heart of the Dustveil, amid the death and silence of forgotten places, life had spoken, and it had said, "Not yet." For several heartbeats, time seemed to freeze. Silverthorn stood motionless in the swirling storm, the desert wind thrashing his battered body, whipping his blood-streaked mane around him like a banner of defiance. Every muscle along his frame quivered, but still he stood. Tomas remained kneeling, his head bowed in quiet reverence, as if in prayer. The storm, the world, the rules of life and death, all of it seemed to fall silent before the raw miracle unfurling before their eyes. Elena couldn't move. She felt paralyzed, not with fear, but with awe. It was like watching something ancient and sacred, something that had not been seen for thousands of years, reawakened from the forgotten corners of existence. Silverthorn shifted his weight again, this time more surely. He lifted his wounded leg, testing it with a tentative step. He grimaced, if a horse could grimace, the movement rough and clumsy, but determined. Another step. Then another. A strangled cry tore from Glenn's throat. Elena clutched at the fence, nails digging into the steel. Each halting stride Silverthorn took was a slap in the face of every rule of medicine, every law of biology they had ever known. Tomas's chant had ended, but he began a different song now, softer, lower. A melody so ancient it seemed to vibrate within the bones of the earth itself. A song of endurance, of survival. A song for those who chose to stand even when every force screamed for them to fall. Silverthorn's breathing, ragged before, now deepened. He was still fevered, still bleeding, still fragile beyond words. But there was strength in his steps. A slow, terrible, beautiful strength. He limped forward, reaching the very center of the circle Tomas had drawn. There, he stopped, and lifted his head fully. High. Proud. A stallion. Not a dying creature. Not a victim. A warrior. The sandstorm raged all around, but Silverthorn stood untouched at its heart, as if the storm itself bowed before his will. Tomas slowly rose to his feet. He approached with deliberate slowness, never breaking eye contact with Silverthorn. Reaching out one weathered hand, he placed it gently against Silverthorn's neck, just above the shoulder. For a split second, Elena's breath caught, half expecting the wild stallion to recoil, to flee. But Silverthorn didn't move. He accepted the touch. Acknowledged it. Tomas closed his eyes. His fingers spread lightly across the matted, filthy coat, feeling the life thrumming weakly beneath. And then he whispered, barely audible above the howl of the desert. You choose life. You choose the storm. So be it. A final gust tore through the valley, scattering the crushed herbs, ripping open the sky with a roar that shook the earth beneath their feet. And when it passed, Silverthorn still stood. Unyielding. Undiminished. Alive. Tears streamed down Elena's face now, unchecked. Not from sadness. Not even from relief. But from the sheer, unbearable beauty of witnessing something so raw, so improbable, that no words could ever capture it. Silverthorn turned his head slightly. For one moment, one impossible, shining moment, his eyes locked onto Elena's across the broken fence. And in that gaze, she saw not an animal, not a patient, not even a symbol. She saw a soul. Not all who wander are lost. Not all who fall are broken. Some simply walk deeper into the storm and come out the other side. The last of the storm's fury passed, leaving behind a battered valley cloaked in a strange, heavy silence. Dustveil lay stretched under the pale sky like the skeleton of a forgotten world. And at the heart of it, Silverthorn stood. Tomas lowered his hand from the stallion's neck, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply stood there, sharing this space with the creature who had defied everything, injury, infection, death itself. Glenn slowly approached from the sidelines, disbelief etched into every line of his weathered face. Is this real? He breathed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile miracle they were witnessing. Elena wiped the dust and tears from her cheeks, her throat too tight to answer. Instead, she watched. Watched as Silverthorn shifted his stance, not in collapse, but in gathering strength. Watched as he tilted his head slightly toward Tomas, acknowledging the connection forged in the heart of the storm. Tomas turned to Elena and Glenn, his voice low but steady. The choice is no longer ours, he said. He has chosen. Now, we must honor it. Elena stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft sand. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle Silverthorn. But the stallion didn't flinch. He watched her with those deep amber eyes, eyes that now burned with a quiet fire. Not fear, not resignation, but will, pure and fierce. She knelt several feet away, lowering herself to his level, her hands resting on her knees. "You fought for this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You earned it." Silverthorn twitched his ears forward, catching her voice through the thin, battered air. A rumble of something deep, something primal, stirred within his chest. Not a whinny, not a cry, but a sound of acknowledgement. A warrior's vow. Tomas stepped back, giving space. This moment was no longer his. It belonged to Silverthorn, and to the life he had wrestled back from the edge of oblivion. Above them, the sun finally broke through the thinning dust clouds, casting long, sharp rays over the valley floor. The light caught Silverthorn's battered coat, igniting it into molten silver. His scarred body was raw, brutalized by suffering, yet standing there, he was something more than flesh and blood. He was survival made manifest. Glenn whispered, half in awe, half in prayer, "He's magnificent." Tomas nodded once, a solemn gesture. "Magnificence doesn't come from perfection," he said quietly. "It comes from enduring." The wind settled into a soft whisper now, tugging gently at the edges of Tomas's cloak, lifting wisps of Elena's hair. The world seemed to exhale, as if even the desert itself acknowledged the miracle it had just witnessed. Elena rose to her feet, never taking her eyes off Silverthorn. Her medical mind catalogued every symptom, the fever that still lurked, the deep wounds that would take weeks to heal, the scars that would never fully fade. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. Because healing wasn't just a matter of flesh and bone. It was a matter of will. And Silverthorn's will had spoken louder than any prognosis. He had chosen life. Tomas moved quietly to the edge of the circle, gathering the remains of his crushed herbs into his pouch. Before he left, he placed one hand briefly over his heart, a silent blessing, and spoke a final word in the ancient Washani tongue. Ashoma. Elena didn't know what it meant, but she felt it resonate in the marrow of her bones. A promise. A bond. A remembrance. Silverthorn lowered his head slightly, as if receiving the blessing, then turned his gaze back to the horizon, where distant, shimmering ridges of the desert beckoned under the rising sun. Glenn spoke after a long silence. "What now?" Elena drew in a long, steadying breath. The decision no longer lay with her hands, or her syringes, or even her science. It lay with Silverthorn, and whatever destiny awaited him beyond this broken valley. "Now," Elena said, her voice strong with certainty, "we see if the wild will truly call him home." And as they stood there, battered, exhausted, forever changed, they watched as Silverthorn lifted his head to the winds of Dustveil and took his first true step into a life reclaimed. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, bleeding the last light into a bruised purple sky. Dustveil settled into its nightly deathly silence, broken only by the whisper of cold winds dragging across the brittle earth. The valley was a cradle of darkness now, a place where time thinned and the line between life and death blurred. Elena huddled beside Silverthorn's battered frame, wrapping a heavy blanket around his trembling body. The stallion lay collapsed on his side, breathing shallow, sweat and blood mixing with dust to form grim patterns across his silver coat. The adrenaline of the day's miracle was fading, leaving only the brutal reality. Silverthorn was alive, but just barely. Every few minutes, Elena checked his pulse. Each time, her heart clenched harder. The beat was erratic, fading, struggling. Beside her, Glenn stoked a small fire, their only defense against the desert's frigid night. Tomas sat cross-legged on the opposite side, motionless, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. His eyes never left Silverthorn. Not once. Elena fought to stay awake. Her body screamed for rest, her muscles ached with exhaustion, but she refused to leave Silverthorn's side. Each shallow breath he took was a battle, and she would not abandon him in the middle of it. She wiped his face gently with a damp cloth, trying to lower his raging fever. She adjusted the makeshift four, willing the fluids into his failing veins. "Come on," she whispered under her breath. "Fight, damn you! Fight!" A sudden gust rattled the fire, throwing sparks into the dark. For a terrible moment, Silverthorn's chest stopped rising. Elena's hands flew to his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. Nothing. "No, no, not now," she gasped, slapping his side, rubbing his ribs. The stallion's skin twitched weakly under her touch. And then, a ragged, broken gasp tore from his lungs. He was still fighting. Still here. Elena closed her eyes briefly, fighting the wave of relief that almost knocked her over. She leaned her forehead against his sweat-soaked mane, breathing in the sharp, bitter scent of survival. Tomas spoke, his voice soft and deep, almost blending with the crackle of the fire. "There are stories," he said. "From before Dustveil was even called by that name." Elena lifted her head, blinking grit from her lashes. Tomas's face was a mask of shadow and flame. "Stories of the ghost horses," he continued. "Creatures born from storm and spirit, guardians of the natural world." He spoke not as if telling a myth, but as if recounting history. They appear only when the land is on the brink of losing itself. When men forget respect. When the desert's heart begins to fail. His eyes flickered to Silverthorn. "Some say the ghost horses choose vessels among the living, to carry their legacy forward." Elena swallowed hard, feeling the ancient weight of his words settle into her chest. Was that what Silverthorn was? A spirit reborn to remind them? To defy the slow rot of forgetting? Another gust of wind moaned across the valley, and the fire flared violently. Silverthorn stirred again, a low whimper escaping his cracked lips. Elena pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the faint thrum of a pulse trying, stubbornly, to steady itself. She smiled through the tears burning her eyes. "You stubborn, magnificent soul," she whispered. "You're not going anywhere." And as she whispered, a memory, long buried, surged up unbidden. A dusty field behind a forgotten ranch. A trembling foal, abandoned and skeletal, too weak to stand. A much younger Elena, hands clumsy but determined, fighting tooth and nail to save him. She had stayed up all night then, too. Fought the same war against the cold, against death, against despair. And when dawn broke, that little foal had lifted his head and nuzzled her hand. The first life she had ever saved. The first proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible could be made real. Elena blinked hard, dragging herself back to the present. This was no different. No easier. No less vital. She would not let Silverthorn fall. Not tonight. Not while there was still even a shred of light left in him. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. The fire sputtered low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley floor. Elena barely moved, afraid that even shifting her weight might disturb the fragile thread holding Silverthorn to this world. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow, erratic. Each time his chest stilled longer than a few seconds, Elena fought back the rising panic clawing at her throat. She whispered to him constantly. Nonsense words, prayers, promises. Anything to anchor him. Outside the fire's circle, Dustveil stretched away into an endless black void. It was easy, in moments like this, to believe they were the only living souls left in the world. Tomas remained a silent sentinel by the fire. At one point, when Elena's exhaustion nearly overtook her, she saw him scatter a handful of crushed herbs into the flames. The smoke curled upward, pale and sweet, carrying something that felt like hope into the freezing night. Around midnight, Silverthorn's pulse faltered again. His whole body shuddered violently, legs kicking weakly at the ground. Elena dropped beside him, heart pounding. "Stay with me," she gasped, pressing both hands against his side. "Please, stay." Silverthorn thrashed once, eyes rolling white with fear and pain. For one terrifying second, Elena thought he was slipping beyond her reach. But then, a deep, ragged breath rattled from his chest. His body sagged back into the dirt. Still here. Still fighting. Elena sat back on her heels, tears spilling freely now. Her hands shook as she adjusted the four, checking the wound dressings Tomas had helped her apply. Every instinct in her screamed that it wasn't enough. That she was losing him inch by inch. And then, as if the desert itself responded to her desperation, a breeze stirred across the valley. Not cold. Not biting. But warm. Gentle. Carrying the faint, sweet scent of creosote and sage. The fire flared brighter. The smoke twisted into strange, spiraling forms, shapes that for a moment looked like running horses, manes flowing wild in the phantom wind. Elena blinked, heart thundering. Was she imagining it? Or was Dustveil speaking back? Tomas murmured something in Wazhani, a blessing too old for English words. He threw another handful of crushed sage into the flames. The scent deepened, rich and earthy, ancient and defiant. Silverthorn stirred. Not convulsively this time. Deliberately. He shifted his weight, his battered muscles trembling but responsive. A low, broken whicker escaped his throat. The first sound of Truel she had heard from him all night. Elena gasped. She pressed a hand to his muzzle, feeling the weak but steady exhale of warm air against her palm. "You're still fighting," she whispered, her voice cracking into a laugh and a sob all at once. "Good boy. Good boy." Tomas's voice carried across the fire. "The ghost horses do not choose lightly." Elena turned, breathless. Tomas's eyes gleamed in the firelight, ancient and knowing. "When they choose," he said, "they choose the ones who can walk through death and come back bearing the dust of both worlds." Elena stared down at Silverthorn. His eyes, still clouded with pain, met hers. And in that gaze, she saw it. Not surrender. Not pleading. But a challenge. A promise. Silverthorn was not finished. Not tonight. Not yet. The wind shifted again, scattering ash and embers high into the black sky. Elena wrapped the blanket tighter around Silverthorn's frame, murmuring soft encouragements, smoothing back his tangled mane with bloodied fingers. They would fight this night together. One breath, one heartbeat, one stubborn miracle at a time. And somewhere out in the unseen vastness of Dustveil, the spirits of the ghost horses galloped unseen beneath the stars. Their hoofbeats echoing in the pulse of the desert. And in the heart of a single, defiant Mustang refusing to fall. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched into a gray, dreamless eternity. The desert held its breath. And within the fragile bubble of firelight, two souls, one human, one Mustang, waged a war no one else could see. Elena refused to let herself blink too long, afraid she might miss the moment Silverthorn needed her most. Every shift of his ribs, every tremor of his muscles, she counted, memorized, willed onward. The night deepened. Cold seeped into her bones. Fatigue gnawed at the edges of her mind, dragging her toward the black pit of hopelessness. Across the fire, Tomas remained motionless, a figure of stone and silence, watching, waiting. Not interfering. Trusting. Around 3 a.m., Silverthorn's breathing grew shallow again. Elena sat bolt upright, panic slamming into her chest. She pressed her hands to his flank, feeling for the heartbeat she had clung to for hours. It fluttered, faint, fragile, a bird trapped against storm winds. "No," Elena whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare give up now." She adjusted the four again, her fingers numb with cold and terror. She rubbed his legs, massaged his chest, anything to coax life back into his battered body. Tomas rose then, slow and deliberate, and moved to the fire. He dropped the last of his sacred herbs into the flames. The smoke rose, thick, sweet, ancient, swirling around them like a blessing woven from memory and prayer. And somewhere in that swirling mist, Elena thought she heard hoofbeats. Soft at first. Then louder. A phantom sound pounding across the fabric of the night. Her eyes widened. Was she dreaming? Was exhaustion finally breaking her? Or had the desert truly awakened tonight? Silverthorn stirred. His ears twitched. His nostrils flared, pulling in the scent of fire and herbs and wind. A low, rattling breath shuddered from his lungs. And then, slowly, painfully, he lifted his head from the ground. Elena gasped aloud, tears springing hot and fast down her frozen cheeks. Glenn swore under his breath, staggering to his feet. Silverthorn swayed. But he stayed upright. His body, broken and bleeding, still answered the call of something deeper than flesh and bone. The call of the wild blood inside him. The call of the storm. Tomas smiled then, a slow, small smile like sunrise over a shattered land. "He has chosen," he said quietly. Elena crawled to Silverthorn's side, murmuring soft encouragements. She touched his muzzle, and this time, he leaned into her hand. Not out of weakness, but out of trust. The first faint blush of dawn stained the eastern sky, a fragile thread of gold stretching across the endless sea of darkness. Silverthorn struggled to his feet. Elena and Glenn both moved to steady him, but Tomas raised a hand sharply. "No," he said. "Let him rise or fall by his own will." And so they stood back, watching, waiting, breathing with him. With a groan that was almost a roar, Silverthorn heaved himself upright. He staggered. He swayed. But he did not fall. He stood, shaking, battered, bleeding, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. The first rays of sunlight caught the dust clinging to his coat, igniting him in a halo of molten silver and shadow. A stallion born again from death and dust. Tomas bowed his head, whispering something in the old tongue, a final blessing, a song for those who walk through storms and emerge changed. Elena sank to her knees, overwhelmed. Around them, the desert began to stir. Birds crying faintly in the distance, the first stirrings of a wind no longer cruel, but warm, almost playful. Silverthorn lifted his head toward the rising sun. And in that moment, Elena knew. Whatever came next, whether triumph or tragedy, he had already won the greatest battle of all. The battle to endure. The battle to choose life. Dustveil would remember this night. The earth would remember. And so would every soul lucky enough to witness it. Because sometimes the wild did not surrender. Sometimes it chose to fight back. And sometimes it chose one horse. One battered, broken creature. To carry its fire forward into the dawn. The days that followed felt like breathing through glass, fragile, uncertain, each moment carrying the weight of what might still be lost. Silverthorn lived. But life, Elena knew now, wasn't a simple on or off switch. It was a delicate, flickering flame that needed constant tending. He remained weak at first, lying for hours in the sand under the broad, bruised skies of Dustveil. Elena monitored him relentlessly. Every breath, every twitch, every flick of his ears was a data point she collected with the precision of a scientist. And the desperate hope of someone guarding a miracle. The first clear sign came at dawn 3 days later. She was adjusting the fore drip when she noticed the difference. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Silverthorn's breathing had steadied. The erratic gasps of a dying creature had given way to a slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale, like the hush of waves against a forgotten shore. Elena pressed her fingers lightly to his flank. The pulse beneath his skin was stronger now, not just surviving, but rebuilding. She staggered back a step, overwhelmed by a surge of relief so violent it almost knocked her down. Glenn, tending the fire nearby, caught her expression and broke into a rare, toothy grin. "Tough bastard," he muttered. Silverthorn's fever began to break that afternoon. The angry red flush across his body dulled, and a light sweat gleamed on his dusty coat. A sign that his body was beginning to cool itself again. Elena changed his bandages with gentler hands now, whispering soft reassurances he probably didn't understand, but needed to hear anyway. His eyes opened wider. Clearer. The murky glaze of pain and delirium faded slowly, revealing the deep, burning amber beneath. And when their gazes locked, Elena felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Not pity. Recognition. He saw her. Truly saw her. And she, for the first time, truly saw him back. At night, as the desert winds picked up and whispered over the valley, Elena often sat alone beside the low fire, staring into the flames. Tomas would join her sometimes, his silent presence grounding her when her thoughts spiraled into dark corners. One evening, as the stars bled out across the black velvet sky, Elena spoke without looking away from the fire. "I used to think medicine could fix anything." Her voice was raw, splintered at the edges. Tomas said nothing. Only waited. "I thought if you just knew enough, worked hard enough, believed in the right procedures, you could always pull them back." She shook her head slowly. The firelight caught the tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "But it's not like that, is it?" Tomas's voice was a low murmur against the night. "No. Medicine is a tool. A bridge. But crossing it, that is a choice made in the soul." Elena hugged her knees to her chest, listening to the desert whisper around them. The truth settled into her like warm sand, uncomfortable, yet undeniably real. She couldn't have saved Silverthorn with syringes or 4 bags alone. He had saved himself. With something she couldn't measure, diagnose, or command. Something older than science. Something born from the place where flesh and spirit entwined. The next morning brought the second miracle. As the first streaks of gold split the horizon, Silverthorn stirred and struggled to his knees. It took agonizing minutes. Elena and Glenn hovered nearby, ready to intervene. But Tomas raised his hand once again. Wait. Silverthorn's legs trembled under him, the healing wound along his right flank angry and raw. But he gritted through it, nostrils flaring, breath rasping. And then he stood. Not gracefully, not cleanly, but wholly, entirely upright. The desert winds stirred, carrying with them the faint scent of creosote and wild sage. It felt, somehow, like Dustveil itself was sighing in relief. Glenn whistled low under his breath. Stubborn old devil. Elena laughed, a raw, broken sound that shook loose the fear that had clenched her chest for days. She wiped her face roughly with her sleeve and stepped closer. Silverthorn watched her, his ears pricked forward. Not hostile. Not afraid. Just aware. She extended her hand, palm up. Slow. Respectful. An offering, not a demand. Silverthorn hesitated. And then, with infinite slowness, he lowered his muzzle toward her outstretched fingers. When his breath touched her skin, warm, steady, alive, Elena broke into tears she no longer tried to hide. He was back. And he had chosen to stay. That afternoon, Tomas disappeared for a few hours into the deeper folds of Dustveil. When he returned, he carried with him a battered leather satchel, and a look in his eyes that made Elena's chest tighten with anticipation. They gathered around the small fire, Glenn poking at the embers while Elena sat cross-legged on the ground, exhaustion and hope woven equally through her. Silverthorn rested nearby, standing now more often than not, his battered frame casting a long, proud shadow over the sand. Tomas sat down slowly, the leather satchel in his lap. He opened it with great care, pulling free a thick folder wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the desert's wrath. Before you arrived, Tomas said, his voice low and steady. We had already begun watching him. Elena blinked in surprise. Watching him? Tomas nodded. His gnarled fingers traced the edge of the folder with a reverence Elena recognized. The way one might handle an ancient relic or a sacred promise. This valley, he said, and the horses that pass through it, they are not just accidents of fate. He looked toward Silverthorn, who grazed weakly a few yards away, the sunset gilding the silver threads of his coat. Some bloodlines are older than the maps drawn by man, older than the names we gave to rivers and stars. Elena leaned forward, heart hammering. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare break the spell Tomas was weaving. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. A grainy, black and white image of a wild Mustang stallion standing atop a rocky ridge. Even through the faded colors and blurred edges, the resemblance was unmistakable. The proud, angular head. The deep, sloping chest. The luminous, almost metallic sheen of the coat. His ancestor, Tomas said simply. Taken over a century ago. He spread out more documents, hair sample analyses, blood work, genetic lineage charts. The data was rough, incomplete, gathered piecemeal by tribal elders, sympathetic rangers, and a handful of biologists who still believed the wild had more to teach them. But one conclusion was clear. Silverthorn carried bloodlines older than America itself. He was a direct descendant, almost untouched by modern breeding, of the Spanish colonial horses first brought to this continent centuries ago. A living relic. A bridge between what was and what still could be. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting back a choked sob. No wonder he had survived. No wonder he had fought so ferociously, clinging to life when every rational law said he should have fallen. He wasn't just any Mustang. He was history made flesh. We suspected for years, Tomas said. But no one could ever get close enough to prove it. He smiled then, a rare and gentle curve of his weathered lips. Until now. Silverthorn raised his head from the sparse grass, his ears twitching as if he sensed the weight of their gazes. The setting sun bathed him in molten gold, his scars gleaming like battle medals across his flanks. Elena rose slowly to her feet. She walked to the fence that still loosely marked their camp's perimeter, resting her hands lightly on the top rail. Watching him, feeling the magnitude of what had been entrusted into her hands. Not just a life, but a legacy. For the first time in days, she felt no fear when she thought of the future. Only wonder. And a fierce, tender resolve. Silverthorn would heal. And when he was ready, when the desert winds whispered the right song again, he would run free, carrying in his blood the echoes of ancient hoofbeats, carrying in his soul the memory of fire, dust, and dreams too old to die. And if Elena had anything to say about it, no one, not time, not greed, not fear, would ever cage him again. The desert winds carried news faster than any man could. Tomas heard it first, spoken in low, urgent tones by a tribal scout who arrived at dawn, his horse foaming and his eyes grim. Elena watched from the edge of camp as Tomas listened, his weathered face tightening, jaw set into a grim line. When the scout finally rode off, Tomas turned toward her. And in his expression, she saw a shadow of the storm that was coming. A herd was attacked, Tomas said. His voice was a stone dropped into a still pond. By mountain lions. They killed the lead stallion. The herd is scattered. Vulnerable. Elena's heart dropped into her stomach. Wild herds lived by a fragile order, an invisible dance of strength, trust, and instinct. Without a lead stallion to protect them, guide them, hold the fragile structure of the group together, they would dissolve into chaos. And in Dustveil, chaos meant death. "How bad is it?" she asked, voice hoarse. Tomas looked toward the distant hills, where the morning mist still clung like old ghosts. "Bad," he said simply. "Very bad." Glenn cursed under his breath, kicking at the dirt with his boot. Elena folded her arms, trying to think, to plan, but Tomas's next words stopped her cold. "They need a new leader," Tomas said quietly. "Soon. Or they will be lost." He turned to look at Silverthorn, who stood not far away, nibbling weakly at a patch of dry grass. Still scarred. Still recovering. But standing taller each day. Elena followed his gaze, understanding blooming in her chest like both hope and terror. Silverthorn. He was their hope. Their last chance. If he could be ready in time. The thought was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Silverthorn wasn't just recovering for himself anymore. The fate of an entire bloodline might rest on his battered shoulders. "We need to prepare him," Tomas said. "We need to make him ready for the wild again." Elena nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Determination. Fear. Pride. Silverthorn was no longer just a survivor. He was a future. That afternoon, they began. The training began the next morning. Beneath a sky bleached pale by the merciless sun, with the winds whispering secrets only the desert could understand. They started small. Simple. Gentle. Tomas set up crude challenges around the valley, obstacles made from fallen logs, trenches dug into the sand, mock predators crafted from old hides and bones. Each test was meant to awaken instincts Silverthorn had let fall dormant during his long, brutal battle for survival. The first trial was water. Elena watched as Tomas led Silverthorn to the edge of a dry riverbed, now nothing but cracked earth and forgotten stones. Somewhere beyond the hills, a hidden spring still flowed. But Silverthorn would have to find it. Not by sight, not by human guidance, but by memory, by blood, by trusting the old wild magic woven into his bones. Tomas released him with a sharp click of his tongue. No ropes, no commands, just a silent challenge laid between stallion and desert. For a moment, Silverthorn stood frozen. The wind tugged at his mane, the scent of dust and sage swirling around him. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring. Scenting. Listening. Choosing. Slowly. With the heavy, deliberate steps of an animal relearning itself. Silverthorn began to move. Elena and Tomas stayed well back, saying nothing. This wasn't a human's battle. This was his. Silverthorn wandered at first, uncertain, his hoofs kicking up thin puffs of powdery dust. But then his gait changed. Subtle at first, then sharper. He lifted his head. Ears pinned forward. Body coiling with purpose. He had found the scent of water. Hours later, when he dipped his muzzle into the cool spring hidden among jagged rocks, Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He remembered. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars, the wounds, the long human nights of 4 drips and whispered prayers. He remembered what it meant to survive. The second test came at twilight. Wind. Tomas led him to the highest bluff overlooking the valley. A place where the winds howled without mercy, screaming through the ancient stones like the voices of forgotten warriors. There, they waited. Silverthorn faced into the gale, his mane whipping around him, his body shuddering from the force. The test was simple. Stand or fall. Face the storm or turn away. For long minutes, he struggled. Shifting his weight. Squinting against the sting of sand. Elena clenched her fists, willing him to stand firm. And then, with a sudden, fierce motion, Silverthorn planted his hooves, arched his neck, and flared his nostrils against the roaring gale. He didn't retreat. He didn't yield. He stood. And in that stance, battered but unbroken, Elena saw the ghost of the warrior he had once been, and the legend he might yet become. The final test came 3 days later. Fear. Tomas strung up old hides soaked in mountain lion scent, draped them over a twisted frame hidden among the rocks. A crude imitation, but enough to trigger ancient memories burned into Silverthorn's bloodline. When he caught the scent, Silverthorn balked hard, rearing back on trembling legs. His muscles quivered. Terror flashed across his face. Elena's heart twisted painfully. Was it too soon? Had they pushed him too far? But Tomas made no move to comfort or intervene. He simply stood back, arms crossed, a quiet rock against the swirling winds. Face it, the silence seemed to say. Or be ruled by it forever. Silverthorn shook his head violently, nostrils flaring wide. He danced sideways, eyes rolling white. And then, with a shudder that rippled through every scarred inch of his body, he took a step forward. One step closer to the scent of death. Another. Then another. until finally he stood before the reeking hide, chest heaving, body slick with sweat, but not retreating. Not running. Not surrendering. He had faced it. And he had won. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. Tomas only nodded once, a gesture of deep respect. They didn't cheer. They didn't rush to him. Some victories were too sacred for noise. Some battles deserved only silence and sky and the wild thundering of a heart that refused to break. Silverthorn turned then, trotting back toward them with a growing strength in his gait. His tail lifted slightly, catching the rising breeze. His head arched higher. He was becoming more than a survivor now. He was becoming a leader. Dustveil stretched endless and golden behind him. Ahead, somewhere in the wild, scattered valleys, a broken herd waited. Afraid. Vulnerable. Lost. But maybe not for much longer. Because somewhere in the marrow of the earth, in the breath of the wind, in the blood that remembered storms and stars, Silverthorn had heard the call. And this time, he would answer. Dawn broke over Cloudspine Valley with the slow, deliberate grandeur of a world holding its breath. The sun, a molten crown on the edge of the world, painted the sky in violent shades of gold and blood red. The wind stirred the tall grasses into trembling waves. And in that sacred hour, between darkness and full day, a single trailer door swung open. Silverthorn stepped onto the earth. No lead ropes. No halters. No human hands. Just the Mustang in the desert. Two ancient forces meeting again after a long and terrible separation. Elena stood beside Tomas at the crest of a rocky bluff, her heart hammering against her ribs so fiercely she thought it might crack. Glenn stood a few paces behind, arms folded, silent, his face grim and proud all at once. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. This was no longer their moment. It belonged to him. Silverthorn paused just beyond the trailer's ramp. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring wide as he tasted the wild air. Dust. Sunlight. The sharp, metallic tang of far-off rain. And, faint, elusive, the scent of others. His herd. Far below, hidden among the scrub and stone of Cloudspine, a cluster of mustangs grazed cautiously. Their forms were little more than shadows against the rising light. But they were there. Watching. Waiting. Sensing the shift in the air. Silverthorn lifted his head higher. The morning sun ignited his coat into a river of molten silver. Scars gleamed across his flanks like ancient runes. Not marks of weakness, but of survival. He took a step forward. Then another. And the earth, as if remembering him, seemed to breathe under his hooves. Elena held her breath. Every instinct screamed to call out, to warn him to be careful, to wish him luck. But she stayed silent. Because this was a crossing only he could make. He moved with deliberate slowness down the incline, each stride measured, powerful despite the lingering stiffness in his right leg. The grasses parted before him. The rocks cradled his steps. The wind whispered his name through the bones of the valley. Down below, the herd shifted uneasily. Ears pricked. Heads lifted. Tension rippled through the group like a taut wire about to snap. Elena clenched her fists. Would they accept him? Or drive him away? Silverthorn stopped at the outer edge of the herd's loose formation. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect among wild horses, offering no threat. He stood still. Waiting. The lead mare, a rangy dun with intelligent, wary eyes, stepped forward. Every muscle in her body was poised for flight or fight. She approached slowly, hooves barely whispering against the sand. When she was a few strides away, she paused. Snorted sharply. Testing. Silverthorn didn't move. Didn't challenge. Didn't cower. He simply breathed. Steady, deep, alive. The dun mare circled him, nostrils flaring, her tail high with caution. Other horses began to inch closer, drawn by instinct older than fear. Then, in a gesture as old as the first thunder of hooves across the empty plains, the mare reached out. She touched her muzzle lightly to Silverthorn's flank. A single, electric moment. Elena gasped. Tomas closed his eyes, murmuring a blessing under his breath. The ice was broken. One by one, the other Mustangs approached. Yearlings trembling on unsteady legs, hardened mares with battle scars of their own, young colts dancing nervously at the edges. They sniffed. They touched. They tested. And Silverthorn accepted them all. No dominance displays. No reckless charges. Just the solid, immovable weight of a stallion who had faced death and chosen to live. Slowly, the herd's tension began to melt. Their bodies relaxed. Their heads lowered. A ripple passed through them. A collective exhale of ancient recognition. They remembered. Not Silverthorn the individual, but what he represented. The bloodline. The fire. The wild that refused to die. And so, with no human ceremony, no artificial fanfare, Silverthorn became one of them. No. He became their heart. The moment Silverthorn was accepted, something ancient shifted in the valley. It was subtle, like the first stirrings of a long-forgotten river beneath dry sands. But it was real. The herd, once fractured and wary, instinctively began to realign itself around him. The old lead mare moved to his side, not out of submission, but trust. The young ones, sensing the new center of gravity, drifted closer, drawing strength from his presence. The battered colts, still bruised from their losses, lifted their heads higher. A broken family, remembering how to be whole. Silverthorn didn't prance or roar his dominance into the sky. He didn't need to. He stood there, solid, scarred, unshaken. And in that stillness, he ruled. From the bluff above, Elena watched with tears blurring her vision. Beside her, Tomas bowed his head in silent reverence. Glenn muttered something too low to hear, but the way his hand tightened over his heart spoke volumes. This wasn't just survival. This wasn't just instinct. This was a coronation. The sun climbed higher, its first fierce rays slicing across the valley. The light caught Silverthorn's coat. And for a heartbeat, he didn't seem real. He looked carved from raw light and storm. A creature stitched together from the bones of mountains and the breath of the desert itself. With a slow, deliberate grace, Silverthorn began to move. He threaded through the herd, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. He nosed a nervous filly reassuringly. He exchanged breath with an old, battle-scarred stallion who had once fought for leadership and lost. He circled back to the old lead mare, touching her shoulder in a silent pact. A new order was born. Without violence. Without blood. Simply through presence. And the unbreakable weight of survival made flesh. Then, as if summoned by some silent music only he could hear, Silverthorn turned and trotted uphill. The herd followed, almost unconsciously, forming a loose, rippling stream behind him. Dust rose around their legs in golden clouds, catching the rising sun until the entire valley seemed to shimmer. Silverthorn crested the highest ridge of Cloud's Pine. There, he paused. And the world stopped breathing. He stood framed against the newborn sun, his silver coat ablaze, his black mane and tail whipping wildly in the desert wind. He lifted his head high, nostrils flaring. His muscles tensed, not from fear, but from the pure, terrible joy of being alive. And then, he reared. It was not a clumsy, fearful motion. It was poetry. It was a war cry. It was a hymn to every ancestor who had ever thundered across these lands before him. His front hooves slashed the burning air. His mane streamed like a banner of defiance and freedom. His voice, a wild, unbreakable scream, tore itself from his throat and echoed across the valley. Elena dropped to her knees, overcome. Tomas placed a hand lightly over his heart, lips moving in silent prayer. Glenn just stood there, stone-faced and utterly still, tears tracking silently down the dust-caked skin of his cheeks. And far below, every horse in the valley answered. Necks arched, tails lifted. Soft wickers and deep, rolling calls rose into the warming air. The herd gathered beneath their new king, their bodies pressing closer, their spirits woven tighter. Silverthorn dropped back onto all four hooves with a thunderous impact that shook dust from the ridge. He turned his burning gaze toward the distant wilds that stretched beyond Cloud's Pine, toward the untamed horizon that waited for him. And in that moment, with the herd behind him, with the sun anointing him, with the desert whispering his name, Silverthorn ceased to be a wounded survivor. He became a legend. Not just a horse, not just a Mustang, but a living embodiment of everything the wild still dared to dream. Freedom, strength, survival, fire. He was a king, not by blood, not by conquest, but by the sheer, indomitable force of choosing to live when death had already written his name. And Dustveil, ancient, battered, eternal Dustveil, remembered him as the stallion who walked through storms, through death, through fire, and returned not broken, but crowned. Silverthorn reared one final time atop the ridge, the golden light exploding around him. And then, with a toss of his mighty head, he turned and led his people home. The herd disappeared over the ridge in a rolling tide of dust and sunlight. Silverthorn led them, his silver coat gleaming against the sky like the last bright sword of a forgotten army. He didn't look back. Not once. And Elena, standing alone atop the bluff, her heart torn open in ways she hadn't known were possible, didn't call after him. Because true freedom was never meant to be leashed by goodbye. She raised her binoculars, hands trembling slightly, and found him one last time in the dancing waves of heat and light. A ghost among ghosts. A king among kings. And then, as if the earth itself swallowed the moment, he was gone. Only the rippling grasses remained, whispering his passage. Only the sky, impossibly vast and blue, bore witness to his legend. Only her heart carried the echo of his thunder. Elena lowered the binoculars slowly, savoring the sting of tears she didn't try to hide. There was no sadness in her, not really. Only awe. Only gratitude. Only the staggering, humbling realization that some lives, some spirits, could never be measured by human terms. Some beings were born from dust and dream and storm. And when they rose, they didn't just survive. They sang. They taught. They set fire to the dark places inside us. Places we didn't even know were waiting for the light. And maybe, just maybe, they reminded us of who we could be if we dared to remember the wildness in our own blood. Elena turned away from the ridge at last. The desert stretched before her, savage, breathtaking, eternal. She walked back toward camp, each step lighter than the last, carrying the story of a silver stallion stitched into the marrow of her bones. Because in the end, it wasn't about saving Silverthorn. It was about something infinitely larger. Saving the part of ourselves that still knew how to fight. How to hope. How to run headlong into the storm, not to escape it, but to become part of it. There are lives that only bloom when we are patient enough to not pluck them in the middle of a storm. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to wait, we get to witness something truly immortal unfold before our eyes. If Silverthorn's story stirred something deep inside you, if it reminded you that true freedom is worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible, then please like this video. Share it with someone who needs a spark of hope today. And subscribe to Gallop of Glory, so you won't miss the next journey where courage, wildness, and destiny collide. Leave a comment below and tell us, what part of Silverthorn's journey touched your heart the most? We can't wait to hear your thoughts, because every soul who believes in freedom belongs here.